Alright, guys, it's probably going to feel a little bit like deja vu here for a second because we're going back to the Industrial Revolution. There's actually what we consider the second Industrial Revolution. Now, some people think the first one just lasted a really long time, but there's enough differences between what we saw happen when we saw the move from homework, piecework, cottage work, whatever you want to call those features, into the factory, and what happens in the second half of the Industrial Revolution for us to label it differently. Okay, so we're going to call this the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, in this Industrial Revolution, this is going to be the latter part of the 19th century, it's the later 1800s, early 1900s, really probably 1870 to about 1914. Actually, not to about 1914. While it may be hard to define when it starts, it's really easy to define when it stops. The First World War. Okay, a lot of people think the First World War could not have happened the way it did without the Second Industrial Revolution, which doesn't say good things for the Second Industrial Revolution. But what you gonna do? So, this is a time of immense innovation, immense invention. Um, while we have tried to stay as much European as possible, it's really almost impossible to talk about the Second Industrial Revolution without talking about the United States at least a little bit. So much of the inventing occurs over in the US that we're going to have to spend. I mean, we're just not going to skip Edison. It's just not going to happen.
Thomas Edison worked on thousands of seemingly impossible projects, but he proved many inventions were possible. Turning on lights, starting cars, watching movies, listening to recorded music, all resulted from Edison's devotion to technological innovation. On September 4, 1882, in Lower Manhattan, New York City, Thomas Edison stood among 6 jumbo electricity generators of his own design at his Pearl Street power station. At 3 o'clock p.m., he turned them on. In the surrounding neighborhood, incandescent lights illuminated in 82 homes and businesses. Edison, born on February 11, 1847, grew up in Port Huron, Michigan. He was deemed a troublesome student at school, so his mother, a teacher who saw brilliance in the young boy, educated him at home, encouraging him to study a broad range of subjects. His mother was right. At age 15, Edison learned telegraphy and spent the next 5 years as a telegraph operator. As he worked with the machine, he saw ways to make it better. In 1869, he moved to Newark, New Jersey, and built a personal laboratory to pursue inventing full-time. A shrewd businessman, Edison made many improvements to the existing telegraph, patenting 150 of them, and selling those inventions to the highest bidder. In 1876, Edison established the first ever industrial research laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Here, he assembled a team of brilliant scientists and inventors to help him innovate, many of whom were entrusted by Edison to be partners in and managers of his companies. Many of the devices that Edison gave the world had been created and built upon by others before him. But Edison's great gift was to perfect those devices and make them ready for use in everyday life. Indeed, the inventions that came out of his research facility changed the world and earned him the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park. In 1877, he invented the phonograph, the first instrument capable of recording and reproducing sound. Hailed as a genius, Edison became a celebrity, even demonstrating the device to the President of the United States. The Wizard of Menlo Park's next act was to illuminate businesses and homes with electricity. Not only did he invent the first commercially viable incandescent bulb, one that was long-lasting, safe, and inexpensive, he established the first power company to bring electricity to homes and businesses. In 1891, he patented the kinetograph, a motion picture camera, and the kinetoscope, a precursor to the movie projector. Even late in life, Edison invented. In 1912, at the request of his friend Henry Ford, Edison designed a car battery for the self-starting version of the Model T car. On October 18, 1931, Edison died in New Jersey. At the time of his death, he held a record 1,093 U.S. patents, proving his belief that if we did all the things we are capable of, we would literally astound ourselves.
So you can see just a few of these major changes, and think about how influential these are. Okay, switching to cars, assembly line products, electricity for lighting things at home, the safety of moving from electricity or to electricity from open gas in your home, which seems crazy now. Telephones, just you can call somebody. You've never heard somebody else's voice that wasn't standing next to you before. What an amazing thing. Phonographs, you can keep a record of what a piece of music. What if you live far away from any sort of concert halls? You may have never heard an orchestra perform in your entire life, and now you can have it in your home. Airplanes, roller coasters. I hate them, but many people love them. Skyscrapers meant that cities could grow almost without limit. The ground you're on is no longer the limit. The sky is literally the limit. So huge innovations. Typewriters, movies, what else did I... So many things. And these are a little bit more, in some ways, some of the consumer things, but new ways of producing gasoline, new ways of producing steel. All of these technical breakthroughs are going to push the world in different directions. It's also going to result in some of our first kind of trust building, not like faith and trust. I'll explain trust in a second. In 1851, Britain had hosted something called the Crystal Palace Exhibition. It was a World's Fair, basically, although heavily focused on Britain. And it was a showcase. Oh, people flocked to it. It was a showcase of all the new industry. But if you look at what they're showing in the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, it feels old, okay? It feels very handmade. It's got machines, but those machines are made with handmade parts. It has this, well, that's not modern feel. Just a few years later, the World's Fair is going to come to the U.S. in the Columbian Exposition. And the Columbian Exposition is going to feel a lot more current. I just made a little pun. There's a lot of electricity in it. And there's a big fight over if you'll use AC current or DC current. Tesla beats out with his AC current. His alternating current wins over DC current. Side note, sorry. But we're going to watch a little thing here on the Columbian Exposition just to show you kind of how amazing all this new technology. So many people came to the Columbian Exposition. They estimate about a third of the U.S. population showed up at it. People from everywhere, from all over the world. It was enormous. It's held in Chicago. You can still see a little bit of the White City that they called it, but we'll see more of that in the video.
Come one, come all to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the fair that defined the future of Chicago. Industrialization, electricity, the world's first Ferris wheel, a Liberty Bell made out of citrus fruits. Chicago was the second largest city in the United States in 1892 and beat out some major competitors for hosting the fair that year. The Great Chicago Fire had destroyed a large portion of the city 22 years earlier, and the American Civil War had destroyed a large portion of the entire United States 6 years prior to that. So the World's Columbian Exposition was a proverbial rising from the ashes, much to the pride of many Chicagoans. More than 27 million tickets were sold during the 6 months that the fair was up and running on the southeast side of Chicago. That accounts for about a third of the entire U.S. population that year, not to mention participants from 46 other countries. Admission was a steep 50 cents, which is about $12 in today's American dollar. Some were so desperate to visit that they mortgaged their homes to travel hundreds of miles to see this spectacle of of 200 temporary buildings housing 65,000 exhibits. Prizes were awarded to exceptional displays and exhibits, and one such item to win acclaim was Pabst Blue Ribbon. People continue to celebrate this victory today with ceremonies around ping pong tables in college basements around the world. Speaking of prizes, one outstanding participant from the fair was Carl Akeley, who you may certainly remember from some of our earlier episodes. In 1892, he was contracted to work on some specimens for this very exhibition. Around that time, he was jonesing to move on to some bigger and better things, and it was in 1895, 2 years after the fair officially closed, that he was finally hired to become the Field Museum's first chief taxidermist. In addition to fostering goodwill and happy feelings for America's industrial age and new novel concepts of sanitation, like fair organizers designing a system to remove the 3.2 million gallons of human waste from the 3,100 toilets every day. Seriously, these are the underappreciated accomplishments of mankind. The 1893 World's Fair is also responsible for establishing the first collections of the Field Museum. Part of the reason we didn't inherit every item from the Columbian Exposition, however, is that it was a trade show and nearly every item was for sale. Many of the early specimens that we have from this collection still have their original price tags, including this $5 plant fossil. It's about $125 in today's money. It's a steal! Don't actually steal it. Countries from all across the globe brought trade items as bragging symbols to show off their unique natural resources. Displays devoted to economic botany boasted enticing oils, beautiful woods from native trees, gigantic bags of cannabis seeds, all for the purpose of advertising the diversity of their geographical regions and how their natural resources contributed to the newly developing global trade network of goods. I should probably emphasize here that the fair was probably the most significant cultural and educational event in some people's entire lives at that point. Books were expensive, public schooling wasn't incredibly structured, and the world was a gigantic place without Reddit or YouTube. It was the first time many people had seen items from another country, not to mention artifacts from different continents. It's baffling to think today that something as intricate as this necklace from the Zulu of southern Africa was, at the time, seen as primitive art. The World's Fair was organized during a time in America's history when Eurocentrism prevailed in the upper class and thus was projected into most displays and exhibits. Judging by how incredibly detailed this artifact is and realizing the intense care and expertise required in creating it, I think it's safe to say that Westerners in the 1890s were woefully wrong about many things. Other cringeworthy events include organizers capitalizing on the novelty of various cultural groups. They brought in native peoples to reconstructed villages to specifically have them act out traditional life to fairgoers, as if their lives were spectacles to be ogled at. At that time, a lot of the reason for collecting artifacts by early anthropologists was to prove by comparison the progress of the Western world. Anthropology today is thankfully more about telling the human story and not about amassing individual objects from cultures without context. Today, we heavily focus on working with various cultural groups in order to co-curate collections. The fair occurred during a time when these items weren't necessarily seen as objects of study, but more as utilitarian and exotic items. Many were seen as symbols of wealth, beauty, Western colonialism, everything from large trophy mounts of animals and their fashionable byproducts to prizes from colonized nations. In these objects, we see reflections of schools of thought from the latter part of the 19th century. Things like meteorites weren't fully understood. One of these specimens, the Elbingen meteorite, was originally thought to be a bad omen from the gods when it was discovered in medieval Europe. People in the 1890s obviously didn't have the technology we have now that helps us to better understand our world, but it does make you wonder what people 100 years from now will think of our way of seeing the world. Today,
So, the second industrial revolution is going to have just wide-ranging effect. We're going to see larger factories. You wouldn't think it's possible. The factories get bigger, partly because they're building bigger things. I mean, it's one thing to weave a lot of cloth. It's another to build a bunch of cars. All right, this takes a lot of space. Enormous profits. This is where we're going to get into some of that trust things. So a trust is sort of like a monopoly. There are going to be monopolies. In some places they're called cartels. But these big factory owners, these big industry owners, will sometimes collude with each other to maintain prices so that the spirit of competition is taken out. And eventually we're going to have to turn this around and get government regulation on those sorts of things. But a lot of times these things are too big for one person. You can have new forms of business organization, some limited liability corporations. We're going to have some emerging labor unions, right? People are finally starting to unionize to get better conditions. Some people try and get rid of unions. Henry Ford, kind of notorious for this one, offers the best wages anybody's ever heard of, a whole $5 a week. But before you can get them, you have to promise not to unionize. Okay? Electricity has an enormous impact. It is able to power so many things, both publicly and privately.
On May 1st, 1893, as a great choir broke into song, President Grover Cleveland flicked a switch and 160,000 light bulbs lit up the evening sky over Chicago, opening the Columbian Exposition. The Exposition signaled the coming triumph of alternating current over direct current.
Communications, we go from telegraphs to telephones to wireless radio signals. All of these things allow us to keep in contact with the rest of the world. Railroads, obviously we're going to talk about in just a second, but it's more than railroads. Subways, electric cable cars. People are able to get around the city in ways that they haven't been able to before. Life is still difficult for the industrial worker. Not going to lie, it hasn't gotten great yet. But it is getting better, largely not because of what's happening in the factories, and we still have not as much regulation as we really need there, but the city life is getting better. We're going to talk about some changes that happen to these urban areas that will help out with that. Development of steel and oil, as mentioned, steel is going to take off, oil is going to take off, petroleum products in general, and then the growth in railroads. This is a U.S. example, but I think it's going to show you pretty definitively how the railroad boom is going. This is railroad tracks in 1850, certainly respectable, not too low, although you'll notice the real sparsity of railroads in the South, which is going to be a problem in the Civil War. But in 1890, whole different story. They're everywhere. And this is going to coincide with improvements in passenger cars, in cargo containers, all sorts of things that make the railroads vital. A lot of this is possible because steel rails are more available. They've come up with some new processes for the production of steel that are faster and produce a higher quality steel at a cheaper price, all good things, and allow railroad tracks to be expanded exponentially across the world. Now, there are other pieces here besides just inventions, though. Productivity went up at least 3 times, at least threefold, over the Second Industrial Revolution. But that doesn't necessarily bring economic stability. Sometimes factory owners focus so much on how much they could build, they didn't think about who's going to buy it. Especially when you're paying your workers very, very low wages. It's one of the reasons Ford had the $5 wages. He wanted his workers to be able to buy his cars. But if you have a really low wage system, it doesn't matter how much you can produce if no one can afford to buy it. And so we'll go through these big boom and bust cycles where everybody's making tons of money, they make too much stuff, no one can afford it, the bottom of the market falls out, all those people get fired, they can't afford anything, and up and down it goes. Depressions back and forth. But in general, we are seeing a better standard of living for most people. By the 1850, in the developed European countries, famine ceases to exist. Okay, that's a big deal. From the beginning of time, from people beginning to farm until 1850, no place had not worried about famine. And then suddenly with this agricultural revolution we saw in the first industrial revolution, and even more technology invented in the second that helps farmers. If you live in a developed area, now Ireland still has a potato famine, Russia has a massive famine, but if you're in that kind of industrialized belt, the US, into England, France, Germany, that sort of thing, Famine's not really something you worry about. Disease, yes, that's still a problem. But famine, not so much a problem. Okay? We're going to get multinational corporations. These are basically, it just means that corporations work in multiple countries and not just within their own empire. Of course, we've had certainly corporations that worked within their own empire in multiple countries, but U.S. companies with outposts in Europe, and European companies with investments and interests in America, and that sort of a thing. So multinational corporations, which makes taxation a tricky thing and legal problems, but we'll deal with all those. Sanitation. Oh, this is one of the biggest things that improves the lives of the industrial worker, is that the cities begin to do a better job with sanitation. They figure out how to enclose sewers so they're not open cesspools running through the city. Improved transportation means not as many horses pooping in every city. It's a big problem. Okay? Running water, outhouses that can connect to the sewers. In the upper middle class and wealthy houses, you actually have flush toilets indoors. You don't even have to go outside. And with that betterment of sanitation, you're going to decrease typhus, you're going to decrease cholera, you're going to decrease typhoid, you're going to decrease a whole host of diseases. And so people, on average, live about 10 years longer, almost a decade longer for the average lifespan by the end of the 19th century from the beginning of the 19th century. A lot of that has to do with some of the inventions we've seen: Pasteur, pasteurizing milk, the raw milk movement. Frankly, I don't know if you're a part of it, but it's so terrifying to me as a historian, because raw milk, unpasteurized milk, was such a deadly product. It could contain so many diseases, and so many children prior to Pasteur died because of problems with milk. That I'm a big pasteurization fan. Reading about the deaths of children before pasteurization, it's not a pretty sight. But we've got some medical advances, some sanitation advances. People are just living better, and they're living longer. And because some of those unions are getting some reductions in how much you have to work, and more middle class people have jobs that start and end at a certain time, there's leisure time. Okay? People want to go do stuff. They're building public parks with green space, because people who moved in the city are suddenly like, you know what's nice? Grass is nice. And so you get these public parks that are built. In 1800, only about 10% of people in the world lived in cities. By 1900, 40% do. That 40% wants something to do. Opera houses, libraries, museums, these big public places where you're allowed to just go spend some leisure time. There's going to be a huge increase in the invention of the department store, and then an increase in department stores. Shopping becomes a major pastime. It wasn't as big a leisure activity, but the invention of the department store is going to take off. Department stores create their own demand. It's a fascinating piece. If you've ever watched the series The Selfridges, that's about early British department store construction. Department stores used to be so fancy. They had beautiful places to eat, and you didn't just go grab stuff off shelves. There was a person working in every department that would hand things out to show you, and they would help you pick clothing, and it was quite the experience. Because we have all these public spaces, because we have all these public needs, because we're trying to provide healthy water, because we're trying to make sure there's enough schools, because we're trying to do all of the things, it's going to necessitate that we also do some of the first census taking. If you're going to provide all of this stuff, you have to know who you're working with, right? How do you know how many schools to have if you don't know how many children there are? How many prisons do you need? Okay. How much housing are you going to need? This is going to create income taxes, because you got to pay for all these things. But we're starting what is really the beginning, kind of the fields of sociology, the social sciences in general. Economics, started in the last 100 years previous to this. But sociology, understanding how society works is going to come into play, because all these people living close together, you got to understand, what does it take to make it successful? Increasing education, more jobs need people to at least be able to read. So a lot of places mandate education for everyone 10 and under. And then they make teachers colleges so that you can guarantee that the people that are doing the teaching actually know what they're talking about. So it's like we saw in the first Industrial Revolution, it just rolls, right? This causes this, causes this, causes this, causes this. It seems almost like an unstoppable force. And many would argue that we're still in the midst of an industrial revolution, and that it is an unstoppable force. The one thing I want to note here is that we are seeing a little bit of a slide back in the prominence of England, of Britain, the United Kingdom. I know they all mean different things, but you get my point. In the first Industrial Revolution, Great Britain had been king, right? They had the factories first, they had the technology first, but that's falling behind by the Second Industrial Revolution. In 1870, Britain had about a half of the world's steel production. By 1880, it's only a third. By 1902, it's only a seventh. In 1870, they controlled 41% of the world's trade, and by 1914, it's only 30%. Now, that's still a lot, okay? They're not hurting. They're just, places are catching up, especially the US and Germany are catching up to them. So why is it that they're falling behind? Well, there's several things. One is a feature of their educational system. The educational system in England, especially the private upper schools, tend to look down on science. Okay? Upper class men study classical things. And there's nothing wrong with classical things, but they consider that you can't mix the classical things with science. Peasants work with their hands, and chemicals are still working with your hands. They call people who study science the stinks, okay? Because they always smell of chemicals, and their clothes are often kind of messed up by the chemicals. So there's this real snobbish attitude towards those who would look to the sciences instead of to languages and literature and history and that more classical educational model. So much so that England's only producing about 200 engineers a year at the same time that Germany is producing 3,000. Even the children of factory owners are not going into the sciences because their dads and their moms want them to be people who fit in with the upper crust, and the upper crust has this one certain kind of education, and that's what they want their children to have. So we're not educating scientists. In the first Industrial Revolution, that was okay, because a lot of the inventions in the first Industrial Revolution are really, they come about by tinkering, kind of messing with things, trying a new way to do this. But the second Industrial Revolution requires a lot more science. You got to understand the properties of steel to know why it's not working as well. You've got to understand the chemical compounds to understand how to make petroleum more efficient. You've got to understand a little bit more complicated scientific things to make electricity work as it ought to understand radio waves. It's possible, but it's a lot harder to tinker your way into this as a hobby. The factories in England also tend not to reinvest in themselves. England starts the Industrial Revolution, but that means that they have the oldest factories. Their machines are the oldest machines. They're not the most up-to-date. They're not the most current technology. And the factory owners tend to see the profits from their factories as their personal wealth. They spend it on land. They spend it on luxuries. They spend it on sending their kids to the snobby schools. They don't put it back in their factories. And so while the US and Germany and France and places like that are reinvesting and getting better, more up-to-date, faster machines, England is not. And they're able to get away with that and still control 30% of the world market because their stuff doesn't actually have to be all that great. Because they have this massive world market, the empire, that can almost only buy from them. Other countries can sell to the British Empire, but there's huge markups, huge tariffs on it. And so it doesn't matter if England makes rudimentary radios. It's still going to be half the price of a better German radio. Okay? And so they don't feel the need to innovate as much as they ought to. They don't feel that competition. It's good enough. It sells. It makes a profit. And so that's a place where they are not keeping up with everybody else. And then they're going to get into an arms race that takes a lot of their money and a lot of their time. Now, we're going to go into this much more thoroughly in our discussions of World War I. But suffice it to say that first with France and then with Germany, they're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time building up an arsenal of new weapons that, until a war, don't really contribute anything to the British economy. You build them and then they sit there. Now, of course, that's infinitely preferable to building them and using them, but we'll see the arms race kind of play out as we go into World War I in the next couple of lectures.